Every week or so I flush this system by adding water to the top. So fresh water goes on top, it cycles down to the bottom, and then this water basically goes over here and soaks into this garden bed. I just side down this row to kind of clear some stuff up, but we keep a watering can here as well, so I can get a watering can and just water the little plants that are growing around here. But we've got tadpoles and fish, and then the filtration comes on a couple times a day. And I scythed out this area right here. I want to show you something real interesting, these scythes. As long as the person who owns the scythe is about the same height as you are, you can use their scythe. I scythed out this edge, and I scythed out this little area here. I'm going to put some trees that I brought from the house here to nursery up a little bit. But look at this. We've got cucumbers, and I scythed the grass out on the outside of these cucumbers. I'll use a hand scythe to get in here and get around these potatoes so that I can start mounding these potatoes up. And you can see down here how precise you can be with a scythe. And then the ground needs to be a little more wet. I could probably scythe down this edge here and the other edge here, but I want to get the plants off the truck because it's super hot. Get everything watered. Here, right here, we have a bunch of berries that are going to get put into a berry patch over here. And then you can see it's a lot of tall grass and a lot of cover crop, and it looks like it's just so much. But remember, there was a do-nothing garden here before, and the production was incredible. So you see all this grass, and you start getting your pattern recognition worked out, and you'll start seeing potatoes in here. So these idle beds that are just getting formed are already growing potatoes. And then when you get out here across, you'll start seeing some beds that are more open. And every so often there'll be a little sump pit to catch that water and soak it into the ground. And by reading the different types of plants that we have here, you can tell that the soil needs some lime. And overall, it's got nutrient in it, but it's somewhat acidic. I see in the paths, there's moisture in the paths. While the beds might be a little dry at the top, we've got a lot of stuff growing along here. So this area was tilled out and planted. You can see the different plants in there. And then these beds are still waiting plants, which we need to get going fast on. And there's a little bit of hose everywhere. We try to keep the hoses in the path. But you can see the tillage dries out, but the beds with green growth, they don't. And I'll show you the potatoes I mounded up. See, these beds, what'll happen is they'll get starts from the greenhouse, and then we'll put mulch around them. See the straw around those celery? And then we're leaving vegetative strips at the base of these different planting systems. And you can see the mushrooms coming in, from where the wood chips are. You can see the corn coming up right here. And below it, we have squash and eggplant. And then look at this. This row has been greened out with wildflowers. So that mound here has a natural vegetative strip of wildflowers. Those little flags will come off once we get stuff growing. Okay, we're working our way around. Here's some herbs and peppers, some basil and peppers. And then again, you see all this overgrowth. You're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Well, look at this. I mounded up potatoes. You can see the potatoes here. And I basically dug around the potatoes and actually dug out of the path as well and did these potato mounds. Now, when I finished these mounds like maybe a week ago, there were not any potato greens. So I had basically buried the potatoes up. There's a little potato bug. I had buried the potatoes up to the tips of their greens. And now we got growth again. And we have some manure on the property that we can bring back here. And I think the next layer will be a pile of manure on it. And see, all these potatoes all the way down the row here are mounded up with the grasses and cover that were around the plant growing itself. Now you can see there's squash in there. Here's the plant again. Now I only mounted the beds that had growth. You see we're all the way down here, and here's a little settlement catch, and then there's squash beyond this point. You can see the squash all the way down there. Now this squash, the next time I cut the grass around the squash, I'll use it and layer it And we'll end up with something like this, where the squash has a bunch of mulch around it. And you know, you might be saying, well, Justin, if you've got all this other stuff growing in your garden, won't it compete with your plants for nutrients and for moisture? And the answer is no. What'll happen is, as you notice, there's a lot of clover growing in the paths and a lot of grasses. The grasses are going to have deep roots, and as we're cutting them off at the ground, those roots are staying in the ground. Some of those roots are dying back and giving us channels for that water to soak deep down into the beds. Some of them are greens. I'll harvest as many greens as possible, usually harvesting them in the morning, and then they'll come back. But the majority of what's growing in this bed is nitrogen fixing plants, hairy vetch, clover, and grasses. As long as we keep cutting the grasses before they go to seed, and if they do go to seed, it's usually rye, we're going to be fine, because the grass becomes mulch, which gives us carbon materials, which helps hold the moisture in the soil by reducing evaporation. And now, yes, we do have grasses like the nutsedge and stuff, and those are not as desirable. There's some other grasses, there's some wild greens in there. But again, as we're favoring the plants we want to keep, actually there's some beans right there. We sometimes find volunteers, by the way. So we'll leave some volunteer plants, we'll favor the plants we like to keep, we mulch around the plants we want to keep, and what it's doing is it's building up soils, it's building up pathways in the soil, it's protecting the soil from soil radiations. And then again, once our main crops get big enough, they will exclude everything else. I'll show you one last thing before we go. This is a bed that's mulched out that has a little better plants in it. So there's peppers on the back, and then these are zucchinis or squashes on this side. And you can see as the zucchini starts to take over, it starts to get these little fruits on it, it shades the rest of the ground and the cover crop stops. So we've chopped the cover crop and layered the cover crop, and we've come back and added compost as top dressing. We've added straw. We added all kinds of materials, and then what'll end up happening is the cover crop will just give up. And that's fine. The cover crop gives up. What we have left is our plants, our desired cropping plants. And sometimes you get some seeds that'll germinate, but otherwise it's just pretty much the plants you desire. And so we've layered in straw. Notice the paths, all that clover in the path, that nitrogen fixing clover in the path. We could actually just rip that off and throw it on top of the beds. Now, because we're not pulling the roots out of the ground, we're leaving behind the root system, which is storing carbon in the soil. And we're also favoring any volunteer plants. Like, see how easy that came out? Look at that, that's a tomato right there. So we have squash, tomatoes, peppers, beans from the previous year. We've got cover crops growing. We've got so much stuff growing that we're favoring the soil and the biology of that soil so that we can get maximum crop with minimum inputs. And the clover in the path keeps growing. That provides shade. If we get a big rain, it'll shade the water and allow it enough time to soak into the soil. And we're also contouring the path. It says dragonfly right there. Look at that. We got all kinds of bees out here. But again, we're growing the biomass at the beds. We're favoring the plants that we want to keep. We're mounding, we're bringing in new materials, mostly from the rest of the farm. There's cows and there's goats and chickens and rabbits here. And so all these materials combine together to feed the plants. Look at these. This is actually a trial that when they planted it, they put a little bit of compost underneath it. And look how much taller those are compared to the other plants. So again, I did this last week. I cut all the grasses around it with a scythe, and then a hand scythe, small scythe, and then I took straw and put it around the plants. So there was layers of this fresh cut material, but there are also additional straw because there's a bunch of straw bales that were out here rotten. And so now you've got good moisture retention, good cover, good weed suppression, and then you end up with beds like this. They aren't pretty, but they're certainly not ugly, and they certainly grow like crazy. And the growing is, again, because we're getting that moisture into the ground rather than letting it evaporate. We're building soil biology by feeding the soil with green material that was chopped and cut in a local space, allowing the roots to stay in the soil, to get deep down inside, and start building up that soil texture. This was all clay before. You can see this one was cut, cleaned up some, and the hairy vetch is taken over. Hairy vetch is nitrogen fixing. This bed right here, it's got pepper plants in it. It's gonna need a little bit more attention because I only processed the other side over there last time I was up here. And again, the potatoes, it's a little bit of work to mound the potatoes. I'll wait till this evening before I do this next row of potatoes here. But again, we're cutting out the cover, putting it around the plants we favor. In the case of potatoes, then we mound on the potatoes, and then at the end we top it off with some straw. There's a bunch of lettuce in here. It's bitter in the evening, sweet in the morning. All right, I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. There's stuff all the way grown down there. And there's a lot of these green strips that we'll side out and plants. It looks a little bit messy, but again, this is all clay soil. After a year or two of doing this, the cover crops won't grow anymore because we'll have so much straw and masses on the top. So every square foot of garden will have a square foot of biomass growing somewhere, because eventually the soil will be so rich in nutrient that we can increase our planting density to do the same thing. But our planting density, instead of putting plants, see how far apart these are? These are like 2 feet apart. We can probably put them 1 foot apart. And when they crown out like this, as long as they're not all on top of each other, they'll do just fine. But we don't really care even that this little grass is starting to come back. Look at this little grass starting to come back. Because we'll just cut it, layer it, and it'll keep going. If you want to learn how to do this type of gardening, this type of broad acreage in a sense, gardening, because you could do this as large as you want. We're not spending a lot of time manicuring and tilling and turning stuff over. The majority of the time is building the structure which slows and spreads water, that takes nutrients from the top of the slope to the bottom of the slope. We're building out the structure points, the water, and then we're planting in the grow areas, the permanent raised beds. And then we don't even take off all the crop residue. All the crop residue gets either thrown in the paths to get stepped on and turned into soil, or it gets again layered back on the bed, like where we started is the area where I'm going to put up a little plant nursery. It takes a little getting used to walking around on the trails because we don't walk on the beds anymore. And then there are challenges you will have when you're moving water down slope. We want to slow and spread the water. We don't want it to flow. So that's why there's all these weird channels. And so we're spreading the water out, but trying to prevent it from flowing. That hydrates the beds. We get much deeper root plants. And then because we're not digging it up and tilling it every year, all those roots are just building that soil structure. We introduce worms, earthworms, and the earthworms will favor living in the beds, and they'll do all of our tillage for us. Again, thanks for watching. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. Click the link below to join our mailing list, get announcements. There's cut flowers that are here coming up. There's vegetables coming up here. There's all kinds of stuff growing on. And if you want to do this for your own property, you want to do this for your small farm, homestead, or estate, we can advise you and get you plans and show you how it all works and really start growing tremendous amounts of food. Thanks for watching. Ask your questions at www.prosperityhomestead.org.